The PC is the greatest gaming system ever created. Furthermore, I believe that the 90s were the greatest time for gaming ever. But both the prevalence of ports and systems back then meant that the landscape was very different than it is now. Over 25 years ago, I had a discussion with my friend. I'd gone round to his house and knocked on his door to see if he was in because both having friends and human interaction still existed back then. We got to talking about computer games, and I mentioned my love for Interplay's RPG The Lord of the Rings Volume 1. He concurred with me, saying he really enjoyed it, and we both started to discuss various gameplay elements. His account of it sounded nothing like the game I played. I thought he was pulling my leg at the time, but we soon discovered that there were actually two entirely different games both released in the early 90s called The Lord of the Rings Volume 1, one for PCs and one for consoles. It brought about a realization in my mind. Games for different systems often looked different, played different, and sometimes were entirely different. You'll note my pluralizing of PCs there. That's because back then there was more than one type of home computer, with many games getting an Amiga or Amstrad version of an IBM-Compatible title, either around the same time or sometimes much later in the day. Likewise, titles from those systems and the BBC and various others were ported to IBM DOS computers. Big deal, James, there was more than one PC back then, but everything is PC now. That makes it simple, right? You want to play the best version of something? PC's the answer. Except even now that's not the case, imaginary strawman I just made up, with the term poor console port being used more frequently than even my beleaguered copy of DOSBox. Back in the day it was even more apparent, with later ports to other systems often taking advantage of improved hardware performance, or simply using higher resolution versions of the original source material. Wolfenstein 3D, as first released for IBM-Compatibles in 1992, serves as a good way to demonstrate how ports can differ from their original source, as it has been continuously ported to new devices for over 20 years now. This is the same game, but just 3 years later on the 3DO console in 1995. It might not be to everyone's taste, but the results clearly differ from the original, and the popular Shoeshine mod for the EC Wolf source port of the game carries on that graphical legacy. The point I'm driving at is that the definitive version of a title might not even have appeared on the system you currently frequent. And nowhere is this more apparent than the side-scrolling Trantor the Last Stormtrooper. I played Trantor the Last Stormtrooper for DOS recently, and it was one of the worst gaming experiences I had that year. The squealing PC speaker music was horrible, the colour palette limited, and the gameplay dreadful. Now look at it on the Atari, or the Commodore, or even the Amstrad. Vibrant colours, better controls, superior sound. And yet if we go to the official Steam release, yes it has one, they're trying to sell a terrible DOS version. The reason for that might be because they don't hold the rights to the other versions. I recently played the port of Street Fighter 2 and it was horrible to control, and the text at the bottom explains why. Many of these ports weren't made in-house, but farmed out to different companies who would then make an approximate version that ran on their system. Since many of the console versions of these games were already ports downgraded from the arcade originals, the games you got for DOS would have been through two cutting down processes. Here's the original Street Fighter from the arcades, and here's the PC version. Ugh. But just because something is released for a superior system doesn't necessarily make it better. Doom on the PlayStation came out with new sound, and while there were a group of players who were greatly impressed by the spooky atmosphere and have even recreated it in mod form, generally speaking the original has never been topped. Back in the day you'd have been forgiven for thinking that Doom 64 was a simple Doom port to the Nintendo console, rather than a straight up sequel with a strange graphical palette and slower playstyle to accommodate controllers. Then of course you'll have a game like Elite Plus, which was ported by programming wizard and general genius all-round Chris Sawyer. That went in the other direction, and improved on the original because of the increasing power of the PC compared to the BBC Micro that Elite was originally released on. There's an entire world of games out there that are intriguingly altered from the originals they're based off, or completely different entries in their own right. And now, with the PC being more than powerful enough to emulate the vast majority of these systems, you can now acquire these titles at garage sales or eBay or maybe a landfill in the desert, rebind the controls accordingly, and subsequently enjoy a superior experience altogether. The moral of the story is to look before you leap when playing retro games, because even though DOS has a wonderful and varied selection of titles, it's always worth checking to be sure there isn't a better version, languishing on some other far-flung and forgotten system. Might and Magic 2 for the Genesis, you say? Don't mind if I do.